Morning, Westside. Well, everybody training for a marathon, everybody running a marathon knows that somewhere between mile 20 to 26.2, your body runs the risk of hitting the wall. Hitting the wall is when your glycogen levels get so depleted from the run that your muscles just stop working the way they're supposed to. And it happens suddenly, like you're all of a sudden hitting a brick wall. And they say that you feel like your legs just are all of a sudden made of a couple tons of jelly, if you can feel them. And of course, that's the time that doubt rushes in to interrogate you, seriously questioning your ability to even finish the race. Well, back in 2015, Yvonne Nakish was in first place for most of the Austin Marathon. And then after 26.1 miles, so in the last 10th of a mile, she hits the wall, and she hits it hard. You're going to check this out. Her legs give out. She collapses to the pavement. Medical personnel rush over to her, bringing a wheelchair. She waves them off because if they help her up, then she's disqualified. So she crawls on her hands and knees, and sometimes her forehead. She crawls this remaining 450-ish feet. That's a block and a half in downtown Austin to cross the finish line. She ends up in third place with a time of 3 hours, 4 minutes, and 2 seconds. Now, if you're looking for an image of grit to take with you today, man, that's a pretty good one right there. I don't know that you're going to beat that. I love that we're talking about grit in this teaching series. Stories of grit are inspiring to us. You find grit in good poetry, in good literature, in every great story, because we need it. We know we want it. Grit is something we want and need for our lives, just to get through our lives, because our lives are guaranteed to include suffering. Suffering is one of the very few guarantees in this life. And you just can't talk effectively about grit without talking about suffering. Can you? No, we can't. So we're going to talk about suffering today, yeah? Here's some applause. There we go. You're with me. But first, before we get into that too far, we got to narrow it down a little bit to figure out what kind of suffering we're talking about. And for our purposes today, let's pretend that there's two basic kinds of suffering. There's two crude categories that we're going to put all the suffering in. First, there's the kind of suffering that you bring on yourself, right? It's suffering that results from our own misbehaviors. And there's a million examples of this kind of suffering, right? I mean, you lie, and people stop trusting you. You get drunk, and you end up hungover the next day. You spend more money than you make, and you end up in debt. You criticize, and you backbite, and you alienate others. Your relationships are going to suffer. I mean, we could do this all day, right? That's just part of living in this universe that God created. There's wise and there's foolish ways to live. And when you live foolishly, you're going to suffer the consequences. But this is not the kind of suffering that actually requires much grit to get through it, as much as it requires some combination of humility and wisdom to actually learn from it. And when we're actually willing to learn from that suffering, when we slow down and consider how our own actions might just be the cause of our own suffering, it ends up being a fantastic teacher. It's a corrective and instructive kind of suffering. It's not fun, but we would call it good because it's constantly inviting us into a better life, a life of wisdom. That's the first kind of suffering, but we're not really talking about that kind today. The second kind of suffering is the kind that you don't bring on yourself. It's the kind of trouble you don't go out looking for. It comes looking for you. It finds you. It's the kind of suffering that happens to people who are already living wisely. People walking the narrow path. They're not perfect, but they're living righteous lives. They're doing the best they can to follow Jesus. It's the kind of suffering that's just evidence that we live in a fallen, sin-damaged universe. And here we are sin-wounded human beings in it. And this is the kind of suffering that absolutely calls for grit. So it is the kind we're going to be talking about today. You've probably noticed that suffering prompts various kinds of why questions. This is just one of the things that suffering does best, actually. It provokes us to ask a wide range of why questions, so many different kinds. You got the causal why, the one that's looking to figure out the cause of the suffering. Why did this happen? Why is this happening? The more philosophical why. Why does a good, compassionate God allow this kind of suffering when he has the power to stop it? There's the entitled why. Why? After all I've done for God, is he letting this happen to me? After all my years of serving him, this is the thanks I get. There's the personally rejected why. That's the one Jesus asks on the cross when he says, why have you forsaken me, God? I'm crying out to you here. Why are you responding to my prayers with silence and distance? Lots of whys. And every one of those whys has its place. When your heart is asking those, there is so much value in articulating them to God. And there's no need to hold back. God's a big boy. He can take it. You don't need to worry about him. There's lots of value in expressing honestly to him the range of your why questions. And when you do, you might actually stumble into one that he wants to answer for you. Christianity seems to understand the value of the why. It wants us to have some good why for this life of suffering that we endure. Listen to what Paul says in Romans. He says, we rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, character, and character produces hope. And then, of course, James, even more shockingly perhaps, says, consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. And perseverance must finish its work so that you might be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. You want a good why for your suffering? James is like, I'll give you a good why. He and Paul are like, God is maturing you. He wants you, he's in the process of making you complete so that you don't lack in any good thing. That is such a good why. He says that's worthy of celebration. You can actually celebrate and rejoice in your hardship. It's radical. Christianity seems to know that it is hard to be gritty through suffering without a good why. In his book, Man's Search for Meaning, Nazi concentration camp survivor Viktor Frankl reflects on how critical it is for a person to know that their life is meaningful, that their life has purpose, a why. And he says you could see this principle so clearly in the concentration camps. Those who knew that they had a task waiting for them to fulfill outlived those without such a task. Those who lacked purpose, who lacked even a simple task to do the next day, were less likely to survive the brutal suffering. And he quotes that line from Nietzsche, who says, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." Man, how true is that? Like when you have a why, you can endure an insane level of suffering. And on the other hand, when you lack the why, man, it doesn't take much to get you to fold. Now, we don't know who wrote the New Testament book of Hebrews. We know Paul didn't write it. But beyond that, scholars really only have some educated guesses. It doesn't really matter that much. Bottom line is, we know that the community of Christians that this author was originally writing to, and the Christians who were reading this letter initially, are going through some tough times, seriously tough times, specifically religious persecution. In chapter 10 of Hebrews, it mentions that these guys, these recipients, were publicly insulted, some imprisoned, others had their property confiscated, all because they followed Jesus above all else. But you know how it is. A person can only take so much before they start to question if it's worth it. And people in that Christian community are starting to fall away. If they're going to grit through this present suffering, they're going to need some more why. And so that's when the author tells them this. He says, endure hardship as discipline. Discipline. Now we got to talk about that word discipline. Typically, when we use discipline, that word, we're talking about what happens to a kid after they've done something wrong, right? After they've misbehaved in some way. That's not what the author is talking about here. He's talking to Christians who are persecuted because they're living faithfully to Jesus, right? Like they're not bringing suffering on themselves because they're living foolishly. That's not what this is about. So he's obviously not saying to these people, hey, I want you to understand that your hardship is actually God punishing you. No. No, punishment and discipline are two different words. Punishment, you'll notice, emphasizes the negative experience following bad behavior, right? So prison is a punishment for a crime. But the word discipline, on the other hand, it emphasizes something else, doesn't it? Even when discipline includes a punishment, that word discipline is still emphasizing something else, the intent, the motive of the one doing the disciplining, right? And what is the intent? What's the motive? Well, it's to teach. It's to train. It's to instruct. To grow a kid up into maturity. You want that kid learning and growing. That's what the word discipline is all about. He says, endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his kid. Actually, hold on, before I get there. Maybe it would be helpful to think of discipline as the thing that your body experiences when you're trying to whip it into shape, right? Now, when I go out for a run, which isn't as often as it should be, but when I do, after about 30 seconds, my body is usually screaming at me, saying, Chip, dude, why are you punishing me like this? Did I do something wrong to you? And I'm like, no, body, you didn't do anything wrong except you're getting old, but you can't help that. I'm not punishing you. I'm calling you up into a stronger, healthier version of yourself. And that always includes a little pain. That understanding of discipline might be helpful. That's what he's saying. He's saying, endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you're not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. He's saying parents discipline their kids. That's what they do. So when you go through hardship of any kind, understand that your heavenly Father is trying to teach you something. That is evidence that you are a legit child of his. It doesn't mean he hates you. No, on the contrary. That's just a really good father loving his kid. Know that. He says, moreover, hey, we've all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of our spirits and live? They, our human fathers, disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, right? Like they disciplined us according to their flawed human understanding of what's best, right? But God, on the other hand, disciplines us for our good, our actual good, in order that we may share in his holiness, his goodness, his purity, his glory. No discipline, no hardship seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, eventually, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. Whenever we suffer in times of hardship, we can trust that God has a really good why for it. God is in some way purifying us from within and producing in us things that may not get produced any other way in us. It's probably because I'm in my mid-40s, but I'm kind of into life stages right now. That sounds pretty nerdy, but go with me. When I was younger, I don't think I was even aware of life stages. I didn't think I knew that there was a thing. Like when I was in my 20s, I just knew I was young and I would eventually be old. That was about it. It was as sophisticated as it was for me. And then I'm like turning 30. It was like, whoa, this is a thing, huh? And then I was turning 40, and it was like, whoa, this is a thing. And I got to be honest. I'm loving this midlife thing. I'm not loving all the things that come with it. I mean, it takes longer to get in shape. Can't read fine print on bottles. You got more trips to the doc, supplements. But for the most part, I really am digging the older life stage. I'm crying more easily at beautiful things. I'm less anxious, less driven by my insecurities. I got less energy than I used to have, but I got more wisdom, and I will take that trade any day. So I'm looking forward to my 80s. Bring them on. So with this little interest, I'm also starting to catch wind of some of the various ways that Christians throughout the centuries have identified and named some life stages in the Christian journey. Now, these guys, these authors and these minds don't have the authority of Scripture, but there is a lot of wisdom to be gleaned from these voices. And there's several, actually. Some break the Christian life into 2 stages. Others break it into 3 stages. But there's one that's got my attention these days that identifies 6 stages to the Christian journey. The first 3 stages include a discovery stage where you're becoming aware of Jesus, and then that moves into a learning stage where you are growing in Jesus, and then that goes into a serving stage, stage 3, where you are giving out of what you've gained, right? And then there's the last 3 stages, which are marked by, first of all, a new and more complete kind of awareness, and then secondly, a more complete growing, and a more complete giving, finally giving of your life in a complete way. It's called love. But between the first 3 and those last 3 is what they call the wall. The wall isn't one of the stages, but you might think of it as the thing that is blocking you from getting to stage 4 once you're in stage 3. Of course, you might also think of the wall as the gateway. It's the way to get to stage 4. The wall is a period of your life marked by some kind of suffering, some kind of crisis in your life. And it could be anything. It could be a divorce, it could be a betrayal, a disastrous personal experience of some sort with a church or with a friend. It could be, the wall could come through a cancer diagnosis or an accident. It often involves some sort of loss. The loss of a loved one, the loss of a career, the loss of a limb or a bodily process, loss of an identity. It could be marked by an unfulfilled longing, inability to have kids, inability to get married, or it could actually boil down to a season of dryness or a feeling of distance in your relationship with God. What makes the wall different from other periods of suffering in your life is that when you hit it, the things that used to work to get you through those hard times in the past, they don't seem to work with this thing. Those tools that you've been using, good tools that have helped get you to where you're at today, critical for getting you here, but they aren't sufficient to get you to the other side of that wall. And the temptation at this point is to give up in some way. Lose heart, maybe even lose your faith right there at the wall. But you don't want to do that. No, to do that is to miss the invitation of a lifetime. Because that's when God is inviting you to go with Him through the wall. And it all starts with the process of looking inward. When you bump into the wall, it looks like this big external thing, that this external thing is the problem. But God is wanting you to move inward, to do some work in there. See, up till now, before we hit the wall, we've been able to ignore all of those most unsightly characters on the interior of our lives, all those fears and false needs and insecurities and attachments that have been the actual driving forces behind so many of our behaviors. And up till now, we've been able to pretend that they're not there and actually compensate for them relatively effectively. But now, can't do that. If we want to get through the wall, we got to face those things. And so we begin the process, what spiritual directors call the inward journey, and what your therapist might call doing the work, right? When we first hit the wall, it looks like it's made exclusively of simply external problems and circumstances, things outside of ourselves that we can't control. But once we make that decision to go through it, we realize that actually this wall is largely made up of the problems within us. And that's precisely the stuff that God really wants to deal with, only with our permission, of course. Now, as you'd expect, getting through the wall doesn't just require the courage to look inward at the ugly stuff, but it also requires grit, of course. That resolve to remain faithful to God through the suffering. You got to have grit. Whether you're going through the wall right now or you're just going through a wall, you might be gritting it just to be here today. If you are, I can't think of a better illustration of the point that I'm making. If your wall has you going through a season of doubt and despair, and you're finding yourself here, oh man, way to go. Way to get yourself here. You are in the right place, doing a very wise thing. I know it doesn't feel like it. I know. You're probably wondering why in the world you're even here, showing up to a party, thrown for a God you're not even sure you believe in, let alone like. I know it doesn't feel right, but it is so right that you are putting yourself here, singing whatever fragments of the songs you can honestly sing, praying whatever prayers you can honestly pray to Him. You keep coming. Even if you got to crawl on your hands and knees and forehead, you keep coming. Because we sure don't want you going through this season of doubt and despair by yourself, in isolation, or worse, with those misinformed goons on the internet. We don't want you doing that. We want you here with us. We don't want you going through this anywhere but with us. And listen, we may not have all or any of the answers even that you're looking for, but we do believe that those answers are out there. And they might just exist only between you and Him. And you can borrow our faith, you can borrow our hope as long as you need to. You just hang in there and remain as faithful as you can to Him. You actually remind me, if that's you, if that's your situation, you remind me of the prophet Habakkuk and something that he says at the very end of the book of Habakkuk. He says, though the fig tree does not bud, and there are no grapes on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, though my life has been completely stripped of everything that once brought me stability and joy, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in God, my Savior. That is gritty. That's the right kind of grit. C.S. Lewis might even suggest that's the kind of grit that shakes the very foundations of hell. The Screwtape Letters is a book. It's Lewis's imaginative collection of letters written from an uncle demon to his nephew demon named Wormwood. And in these letters, this uncle demon is coaching his nephew on how to best manipulate and corrupt the human that he's been assigned to manipulate. And of course, the pitfalls he's going to want to avoid to make sure his human avoids making. And he writes this. He says, "Be not deceived, wormwood. Our cause," that's our demonic cause, "is never more in jeopardy than when a human, no longer desiring but still intending to do our enemy's will," that's God's will, "looks round upon a universe in which every trace of God seems to have vanished, and asks why he has been forsaken, and still obeys." As I understand it, when you're going through the wall, you're asking all your why questions, as suffering always provokes. And at some point, you might get tired of those why questions. You get tired of not getting satisfactory answers to those why questions. You just get weary of the why, which is your cue to help that question mature into a what question. It sounds like this: God, what are you up to right now? What are you doing? What exactly are you trying to accomplish in my life? Note that this question is not a defensive, closed one. It's not, "God, what are you doing right now?" Though that might be a great place to start, actually. Asking that, expressing that in total frustration. That might be where it starts, but it's going to need to mature into the more open, curious, willing form. God, what is it you are doing right now? I can tell, God, that you are not removing the external problems of my situation from my life. So I assume you're doing something else. I assume you're wanting to do some work in me. What is it that you're up to right now? And as I understand it from those who have gone through the wall, the way he might answer that question is something like, "Child, I'm trying to cut out parts of you that don't belong. I am rewiring you. I am purging you. I am burning off all of those incomplete identities and disordered attachments, all those idols and unstable structures that you've actually been putting your trust in. I am freeing you of all those so that you might be able to join me. Join me more completely than you ever have before. Join me in my life and in my love." I've told the story before. When I was a kid, I remember my dad having to remove a fish hook from my dog's mouth. And it was not just any fish hook. It was one of those Rapala jerk baits. So this thing had like 2 or 3 different treble hooks stuck in its tongue and its gums and its lips. And this thing was a mess. And my dad's got the pliers, right? He's trying to help. And the poor thing is just scared to death, squirming all over. We're trying to hold the thing down so Dad can make the extraction. And I remember thinking, does my dog have any idea what's going on here? Does she understand that my dad is trying to help her? With each twist of the pliers, my dog is feeling pain, obviously. Does she know that the pain is a necessary part of his extracting the very thing that's causing the pain? Does a dog have a high enough mind to understand that she can actually trust my dad? You can trust him. He actually wants good things for you, is what I was thinking. And, the pain that she feels with each twist of the pliers is actually evidence of that. Can a dog's mind fathom any of that? I suspect that in times of suffering, the most complete answers to our hardest why questions are probably something like this. Complete, satisfying answers are out there, but our minds aren't high enough yet. Our wisdom isn't yet mature enough to fully grasp the answer. But God's working with us on that. So perhaps in the end, there's actually only one kind of suffering after all. It's the kind that God uses to teach us, to shape us, to purify us, to make us complete and mature as He is complete and mature. It's the kind He allows us to experience precisely because He is a loving Father who wants really good things, only the best things for His kids.